Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Esther Weinberg, and together we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we're stronger together. We are better as one. So let's meet our expert of the week. So Esther Weinberg is with us today, and she comes to us with a very rich background. She is a leadership training expert that has earned a reputation in the entertainment industry as the secret weapon behind game-changing breakthroughs with executives, leaders, and teams. As founder and chief leadership development officer of The Ready Zone, Esther is passionate about helping media organizations understand that in order to drive innovation, be competitive, and ultimately profitable, it's imperative that people come first by creating an environment built on trust, respect, and safety. She backs that up with proven, transformative, yet practical tools and systems that help benchmark and measure results. Despite uncertain times, Esther's not afraid to drop eye-opening truth bombs that dive deep into the ripple effect of change and consolidation. In fact, she rolls up her sleeves authentically and methodically, helping organizations build sustainable company cultures that thrive versus survive. From the fundamentals behind developing a collective philosophy of readiness to take on an industry challenge to coaching leaders on how to reframe, refocus, and align, Esther is a powerhouse. And she spent 20 years in the media industry. We'll get into all of that. She works with clients like Netflix, Microsoft, ESPN, and a slew more. She's a thought leader with firsthand experience, and I'm excited to welcome Esther to the show. Well, welcome, Esther.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's, when you read someone's bio, it's always like, oh, that's me.
But it is, and you're like, wow, I did all that stuff. So how did you get into this work? We know what you do, but how did you decide this is my life's work? This is what I'm going to do?
I would say it's probably a confluence of two separate things that happened in very different years from each other. So one was a seismic moment when I was an executive at Disney. And I remember I was in part of the senior executive team, and we were sitting, all of us together, in a boardroom. We were talking about just normal senior executive-y kind of things. Meaning we were talking about business and where business shifts were going, and where we had to move, and also what was happening to our employee base. And the CFO of the organization said, just think people should know about a third of our work, about a good number of people have left. And so I turned to him and said, well, how many are we actually talking about that you bring it up? Because he didn't bring such subjects up. And he said about a third. And so myself and the head of sales looked at him and said, well, wait a minute. I think that if a third of our workforce has left, I think we need to really re-examine what we're doing, how we're retaining people, how we are properly incentivizing people, what's the workplace culture, all the questions that you would ask. And the response was, well, we're Disney, don't worry about it. We'll get more people. It's not a problem. And so I remember thinking, well, that's inherently true, right? When you work for a big brand, like any big brand, not Disney or Nike or Google, there's an inherent value of brand name recognition. Of course, you're attracted and you want to work there. But at the same time, I thought, well, wait a minute. There's got to be something that we are doing on a very practical level. And at the time, I was in publicity, and it was interesting because I thought, I turned to an HR hat, which I didn't think I had necessarily, and thought, well, what are we doing to really retain and value people? And what are we doing inside of our culture that would make people go someplace else instead of go to us first? Like turn inward rather than turn outward. And so a few months later, I left the company. And I remember, and so that was one thing. And I actually left, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Initially, I thought I was going to start my own public relations agency. And then I had realized that I had been unhappy in that role for a long time. And slowly I started to discover and actually met a woman who was an executive coach And I had never heard of that before, and started working with her. And about 2 weeks in, she said, I think you should sign yourself up to get trained and developed as an executive coach. I think it's your calling. And I thought, well, you're crazy. But when I thought of it more, I thought, well, I have an interest in it. And why don't I? At the time, I was very committed to what I call following the breadcrumbs, which is what I mean by that is, what are the trails of kind of hints or insights that you're getting that guide you as to what to do. And so I did that. And then that really started me on the path of doing leadership development. And that ultimately shaped and formed my career. So that's what I've been doing. Shockingly, for now, it's been over 20 years, which I can't believe when I actually say that number. It makes me feel very aged and wise.
Full of wisdom.
Yes. And so that was the one. And the second seismic moment is I actually decided to pick up and do my business virtually, and picked up and moved to Uganda, Africa, and started doing a business there. And it was interesting because I had really keenly set my eye on doing both the work that I'm doing now and international development for children's rights organizations. And I had this moment, I was interviewing someone because I was doing an assessment about the state of children's rights in Uganda as a whole, as well as the state of the organization, the effectiveness of the organization, two simultaneous Herculean tasks of assessments. And it just hit me, wait a second. The people that are in Africa who are talking to me about their leadership challenges and issues are the same issues I'm hearing when I'm doing virtual calls at night with executives in the entertainment business. Wait a minute, there's something I'm not getting.
Maybe it's more universal.
Yes. And so those were two major pivotal moments in my career that I think really shaped the work and deepened the work that I'm doing now.
Well, it's filled with purpose as you listen to people's challenges and you realize how much we're all navigating similar challenges, but from different vantage points. And of course, different situations, but that it's all too similar, the narrative we hear about culture and about systemic issues preventing people from having the kind of workplace that they want to have, which you and I get to help with, which I find great purpose. And it's fun to hear the story of how you arrived there, because I think I used to think too, like, there's no way I can do that for a living. Like, that's not something I actually get to do. That would be really fun and I'd be really good at it. But of course, that's just too easy. And oftentimes when you really look yourself in the mirror, it's like, maybe this is what I was meant to do all along. Maybe these are signs. And so that's such a cool story, Esther. Well, tell our listeners, I know you go inside organizations and you focus a lot in the media industry, which
Yes.
every industry has experienced just a massive shift this year.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine the stories you're hearing. But you've made this argument for many years in your business about why your company's bottom line is not your top priority. Why people is really your differentiator, and why investing in people should be the thing that people look to for future growth. Tell us, where are people at right now culturally? How would you assess what COVID and racial injustice and all the things we've experienced in 2020? Give us a view into what you're seeing with your clients today.
Well, I think there's part I can compartmentalize, and there's part that's overall. So I think what I would say is, let's actually spin back a little bit pre-COVID for a moment. So before COVID was happening, what was interesting is the stories and anecdotes that I was hearing from leaders got me to a place where I thought, the way that we are designing our workforce is fundamentally unsustainable. I mean, I was hearing stories from people where there was a head of product for a company, and we were having a conversation at 5:00 one night. And he said to me that he looked green. When we were doing a Zoom chat, and this was before Zoom was in vogue, and we're doing a Zoom session. He says to me that he didn't look well. And I said, what's going on with you? And he said, well, I was in the hospital last night. Small things. I was in the hospital last night. They found kidney stones. And I said, so why are you at work? And he said, well, I have a meeting at about 6:30 after you and I talk, and I have to be at it. And I said, well, what would happen if they left you in the hospital last night? Who would have taken over your work today? because clearly that is a systemic issue, right? About how you lead, how you cascade things down. He said, oh, my VP would have done it. I said, well, that's a great idea. Why don't you go home now,
Yeah.
take care of yourself and take care of your health? But I'm telling you, those kinds of stories were not an anomaly. Those were on different scales. Like someone told
Mm-hmm.
their HR head that they were really tired of taking the phone into the bathroom to answer emails. Or another woman at an offsite was talking about that she had to hire a nanny on the weekends because she had to get through her email. So if you add all that up, you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, there was a way that we were working and being inside of the workplace and the way that we structured things that was not going to be sustainable in the long run. So something seismic had to shake it up. Well, welcome COVID. So COVID, I mean, look, I don't wish this pandemic on any of us,
Sure.
and the impact, the real ripple effect. I mean, it's really serious. I've lost friends from COVID, and so it's very, very serious. But I will say, inside the workplace now, what you have is companies were really great for most part of moving people home. Like, how do we get your computers, and how do we get you to have a pen at home and set up your workplace and your workspace? And I think people have turned garages and bedrooms, and the creativity of what people have done to create someplace where they can have solitude is really amazing. But I think what we're seeing now is a few things. It's now the ripple effects. Now that we got people out, now the question is that everyone's on their minds, how do we get people back? But then the question that lots of companies have is, why do we have to actually have people back? And what's the leverage point? And it's interesting because lots of leaders that I know were very reluctant to have people work from home. And man, were they for a rude awakening come COVID, because now people are working from home. So that logic that we need to be in person with each other now is really a question. How do we design? So what happened is that we didn't, now the test that I find the companies are having is, how portable is our culture? How do we actually intentionally, what I find is the question that needs to be on leaders' minds, which I don't think we're quite there yet, is, if I design my organization from scratch and I had people working in a virtual environment, leveraging technology, because that's really what has created such a seismic change inside of organizations. Technology has been a big factor. Then how do I actually design it so that my culture can sustain and that people can actually work in ways that set them up for success? Because I'm sure you've heard this too. People are working more than they've ever worked before. There's a real lack of boundaries, and there's the way that we're leading has to shift. And
Mm-hmm.
that has had to shift pre-COVID. And I think the awakening that people have now, or we need to have, or the call to action, is, how do we choose to lead now in a way where empathy and compassion has to lead as a business imperative to keep people motivated and engaged, and not as what we call a soft skill.
Right. Yeah, I think we knew that before, that empathy was a far better trait in leaders, things like vulnerability, these intangibles that you couldn't quite put your finger on. And they were
Mm-hmm.
often labeled soft skills, which made them feel weak and unimportant and nice to haves, but not must haves. And I like what you said about culture being portable. It's a real test to, manufacture a culture inside a controlled environment is a whole different thing, to have that transcend across geographic borders, all sorts of office spaces,
Oh,
kids,
yeah.
all the dynamics we're facing now. And I suspect what we're seeing in early results is the organizations that were really leading the way, what I call inclusively, and practicing a lot of the things that I know you do at the Ready Zone, is we're seeing these companies thrive even with all of the change. Now, of course, there's setbacks and real challenges with COVID that we'll be wrestling with for quite some time, but doing these things, doing these intentional things to build an inclusive culture where people really feel like they can bring their full self to work is paramount right now. People are telling us overwhelmingly they don't want to work for organizations that don't care about people. And I don't think we ever were willing to sacrifice that, but
No.
maybe we thought we could. Maybe we thought that paycheck was worth it, and that's not something people are willing to compromise anymore.
Well, I think for the data junkies out there, and for the people who sometimes when you talk about, like I remember a leader said to me a few weeks ago, I feel like a therapist, then listening to all these people's problems. But it's really interesting if we look at data, I mean, just purely at data. So Deloitte Industry, Deloitte came out with a study, their annual study, Deloitte Industry 4.0 study. And what was really interesting is they surveyed 2,000 C-suite executives in 19 countries, which is really compelling data. And they said that there was concern, this was pre-COVID, concerns about workforce readiness in acutely in Asia and the Americas, where only 4% and 9% respectively agreed that they had the skills needed to take on the kind of workplace environment and business challenges that we're facing today. Now that's really scary. 4 and 9% respectively. 4% in Asia, 9% in the
Wow.
Americas. So if you take that data and you layer it over real things like in the Ready Zone, we talk about the Ready Zone as a methodology all about creating workplace cultures where trust, respect, and safety are not just valued, but they're actually measured as the bottom line. And we do that in what we call 6 zone performance indicators. There are 6 key areas that as a leader, you can look up and out and say, how do I actually know that I'm creating this level of readiness, like was so lacking in what C-suite executives saw, because people need to see indicators to know that they're actually moving the dial. So that's why we created 6 of them. And we've seen through the course of 20 plus years that when you put that inside of organizations and hone people's lenses towards that, then they can actually transform. So that's, for people that are wondering, okay, well, what's the ROI and what can I hang on to? That data is pretty compelling.
That's great. Well, and in the measurement piece, I struggle with that sometimes in the work I do. I mean, there's all sorts of
Mm-hmm.
pre and post measurements, perception differences, and employee engagement and things you can look at. But at the end of the day, business leaders believe they're held accountable for short-term profitability and revenues and things that show shareholders were focused on the right things. And sometimes we can do that by leaving people behind. So tell us more, Esther, about those 6 zones. If you were to recommend to leaders, what should they be measuring rather than just profits? And I know you've got a freebie on your website that we'll link to in the show notes that
Mm-hmm.
goes through a lot of those 6 areas. But tell us more. Like what now should leaders be focused on measuring and really seeing if they're performing at a high level?
Well, it's interesting because if you think of the questions that, okay, so let's be insanely practical. And I know that you talk a little bit about this too, because we both share the word pivot. And actually, it's one of our zones is pivot ready. But as an
I love it.
example, well, it was really interesting. I heard a piece of data today that that was done by Dr. Dr. Lucy Hone, who shared this in a TED Talk. And she said that in 2005, Marty Seligman and his colleagues asked people to think of 3 good things that happened to them each day. And what they found out over the course of 6 months of the study is that those people showed higher levels of gratitude, happiness, less depression over the course of the 6-month study. And I think they said they were citing that the American Army talked about hunting for the good stuff. So what we talk about in and how this relates specifically is one of the zones that we talk about is this whole concept, because people will say to me, well, how do I actually, if I'm in if I'm in this place where I have a lack of boundaries and I'm being overloaded with work, and plus I'm listening to the news, like how do I get myself in the zone of actually being able to work? So we have this one tool that I think is really valuable for people called pivot moments. So what we say is that your perception plus your position plus your performance equals pivot moments. It's almost like it's a physics formula, chemistry. So meaning that your emotions plus your experience about the changes plus the actions you're taking to support the change actually equals pivot moments. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about how to create it and how it's so easy to do this. Because part of what leaders are struggling with today is how to keep people motivated and engaged in the work. Well,
Yep.
this is a good way for how you can do it for you and how you can do it for other people. So I remember I was having a meeting with one of my executive coaching clients, and one of her intentions for the coaching and for her growth was, while she was incredibly direct and in your face, there was a lot of issues she sidestepped, and she really lacked compassion. She didn't know how to meld that compassion with handling prickly issues. And her role was almost a CFO/COO role as a senior vice president, which I know sounds a little odd, but her aim was to be compassionate and collaborative while being direct, because lots of people didn't want to work with her because she was so harsh. So anyway, at the end of our first meeting we were reviewing logistics, and I said, all right, so we're very Hollywood. I said, my assistant will communicate with your assistant, and your boss's assistant will set up this stakeholder conversation. And she goes, no, do everything through me, which I thought was really weird because she's a senior vice president. One of her goals is to rise to an executive vice president level. And she said that she doesn't trust her assistant. She's not sure if she's the right person for the job. So, okay, we went through, so that was really interesting to me, because I thought, okay, it's a small thing, but it's actually kind of a big thing. So I thought, if you're doing this here, where else are you doing it where you're sidestepping really pivotal decisions that you have to make? So we talked about what her perceptions were of her assistant, her emotions, really just purely what her emotions were about it. So she said that she's really frustrated, she's very disappointed, she's really angry, and she's actually afraid to make a decision about it. But then I said to her, what was your experience about her when you come into work every day and you see her? Like, you walk down the hallway and you just see her just in the moment you walk in. She's like, I know she's doing a terrible job. I said, you really know that from the moment you spot her? She goes, yeah, I know that she misses deadlines. She's not doing the work given to her, even though she had deadlines, and those deadlines are followed up with. I'm sure she's on social media. and she said she also doesn't have the desire to grow, and she doesn't have the aptitude to get the job done. Okay. So I said, well, what actions are you taking to shift the situation, right? If this is terrible and you have these feelings, emotions about it that are equally as awful, what are you doing about it? So she said, well, she started laughing. She said, well, I'm talking to my husband about it a lot. I said, okay, that's great. Okay, good sounding board. And I said, well, what else? She said, well, that's kind of it. So when I asked her how long this was going on for, she said it's been going on for 2 years. And she never did much about it. She tolerated behavior until it was intolerable. The pain of it being intolerable became a place to pivot. When we talked about it, so we talk about pivot moments. What does it mean? Was she examining where she was not effective? Was she admitting her part? Were there other opportunities to move earlier? And so where in our work are we actively looking to make that kind of shift? And
Yeah.
any effective leader looks at yourself first, take responsibility for it. So it's in language. So as a leader, you can do it for yourself, because once she noticed it, then we can easily say, what do you need to stop doing and start doing to bring it closer to your intention? And within 2 weeks, her assistant was moved out. And within 3 weeks, she got a new assistant that is still her assistant to this day and is masterful and is a high potential and a high performer. So the reason why I bring it up is that we wrestle so much today with how do we motivate and engage ourselves and others. And if there's one thing to take away is that you don't need a title to be able to shift the way you're being and behaving and acting and interacting and being able to strategize and have tactical execution in any moment. And this is a way to help you reframe, refocus, and realign your behavior.
Yep. Yeah. And so often people just take that to be normal. 2 years she was dealing with that problem, but wasn't ready to do anything about it until you brought that clarity to her through that framework. So super helpful, I think, for leaders that are wrestling with challenges now. And something that the COVID world has brought on us, I think, again, is this lack, this unwillingness to let things linger anymore. One of the beautiful things, that silver linings that we found amongst the it's not all been positive, of course, but one of the silver linings I found is change brings more change.
Mm.
So we were changing everything. Why not change this too? Right? Why not fix
It's
this
so
issue?
true. Well, I also going to your point of it's not tolerable anymore, is I think that we do need to train and develop people to really understand how to have further boundaries. And I think this is really pivotal because you find many people that have intolerable situations that are tolerating it, that now are kind of fed up. But what happens is, because we're not in proximity to people, either two things happen. Either we're more forceful in a more dramatic way, and we don't actually have the communication nuance to be able to language things properly, or we further retreat and take it on because people are very afraid to be furloughed and laid off now. So that's the danger, I would say, that we need to really train and develop people about how to actually set boundaries first. And we talk about that a lot in the Ready Zone, because there's so many ripple effects of actually not doing it, like what I just shared
Mhm.
right now.
Oh, yeah. And if you don't draw those boundaries, someone will draw them for you.
Oh yeah, we teach people how to treat us.
Mhm.
So the thing is, oftentimes people don't know how. And look, when you first are setting boundaries, it's good to think about where they're strong first, right? Because then it's proof that you can do it well, and then you can write down where are they weak, or other people, or you're permitting other people to cross them, or you don't have any, and you can identify where one area is easiest to enforce a boundary. So you're giving yourself more road to be successful. And then you have to have resilience around it, because you have to remember that if you've taught someone how to treat you, unteaching them is going to be twice as hard as doing it in the first place. But that doesn't mean that it's not the right endeavor to go down.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's an iterative process. We learn as we go. So, Esther, in kind of wrapping up today and sharing these great wisdom points with our listeners about culture and boundaries and motivation, and I love your technique that you used with that great story around your coaching client. Thinking about the future of work and how ominous that's always been, but I think it's
Mm-hmm.
certainly something that's really on people's minds right now as we think about how we're strategically planning right now, wrapping up 2020, looking into 2021, thinking it's probably going to be more of the same next year. We don't know how long this will last.
Yeah.
Probably will
Yeah.
last most of next year as well. I know my clients aren't planning, most of them are not planning to return to the office setting unless they have to, for
Yep.
client service.
Mine too. Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? So if you had to give a suggestion to an executive, a leader that's wrestling with how to build a strategy for next year, what might be some coaching, some wisdom you would share with them at this timely point?
Well, look, the one thing we cannot look, if you and I had a crystal ball, we'd be in the wrong business, to be able to accurately predict where the business is going. But I would say that if I was giving a CEO advice, which I do often, I would say one thing is going to be really pivotal. Number one is, the most important thing is to say what we talked about earlier. If I design my organization from scratch for a virtual environment now, how would I organize it to be designed differently? What are the things that I would need to actively put in place in order to create sustainability? Then the other thing I would look at is, where else can we grow and go and be more flexible in our business? I mean, I love the story I heard about this is a small business, but I love the story I heard about a pizza restaurant in Chicago that when COVID hit, their business was decimated. But they learned that a pizza oven can do many things. And so they started manufacturing PPE equipment, because you can bend plastic in a pizza oven very easily. So I think that businesses are going to need to be more resilient about what are other ancillary places where they can grow, where they can start testing low-hanging fruit most immediately. And you cannot leave your people behind, because I do think that we don't know the economic challenges that are going to come down the pike. We're in an election year. We don't know how that's going to go. We don't know quite how the economy is going to go. But the one thing we know is that the more we can actually look, I'm in a people business, so you're going to get a people answer. Is that the more we actually get people into a frame where they can be more innovative, like the pizza restaurant I talked about. I mean, someone
Yeah.
thought about that. What kind of environment do you have to create in order for people to do that? That's why I say that one of the several things that has to be on a CEO mind is if we were going to invent this organization from scratch and our culture to be portable and for it to be solely virtual, because I think it's
Mhm.
easier when you think about solely virtual, and then if you do bring some people back to work, then it's solely being, well, it's 100% back in an office, because
Yeah.
people haven't thought that way before. So
Yeah.
because what kind of technology innovation, what other technologies can we lean on? Because I think there's technologies we haven't even thought of, because remember, we're also going to an AI and AR,
Mhm.
augmented reality, a virtual reality world using artificial intelligence. And so I think the questions on people's mind is, how do we leverage technology with the existing resources we have?
Yeah.
I know it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I do think that you have to start with the people, because they're the ones who will execute. You can have a great idea, but if there's no one around who can make it happen, then you're not going to be able to be profitable.
And oftentimes, the frontline employees that have firsthand knowledge and experience with customers have the best ideas. So that grounds up innovative thinking. I love that. Great tangible question as a leader is, if we were designing for a virtual world, if we were designing for this world, what would it look like? Instead of what do we have to change? That's a different limiting conversation. It's much more idea oriented when we start fresh and new, and what do we want to start and stop doing as a result of that. So excellent tips, Esther. Thank you for being with us and sharing all of your knowledge with our listeners. Tell our listeners, how can they get in touch with you? I know you have some great resources on your website, so point us there, and we'll certainly link it in the show notes as well, but tell us what they can find on your website.
Yeah. So first of all, the easiest thing is to go to thereadyzone.com. And if what we talked about today with the Ready Zone methodology is actually written in a book called Why Your Company's Bottom Line is Not Your Top Priority, 6 eye-opening strategies to put people first. And feel free to download it. It's for free. And that's one of the many resources, but definitely that will give you, there's a lot of real practical strategies and tools in that, especially for this kind of COVID shifting disruptive environment that we're in right now.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Great value add, and I love that you have pivoting in the strategies.
I thought you'd like that.
It's been the year of the pivot. Oh my gosh, it's on my
Exactly.
vision board, pivot. I'm like, I
Yeah.
can't hear that word enough.
No.
It's very telling of what we have to do, though. Yes, and this is happening now. So thank you, Esther, for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button, and you can also connect with Esther and I on LinkedIn. I am there under Julie Kratz, Kratz. You can also share this episode anywhere you get podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we're stronger together. Thanks for listening. Year one.